So after almost 4 months, I finally got my hands on the new Sony A7 IV. And it's not like I haven't been trying, but I don't know if you've noticed, but it's like almost impossible to find one of these in stock anywhere. And actually not just this, but pretty much everything's been either out of stock or marked up by some crazy amount. And just the other day on eBay, I saw a used A9 II in mint condition going for less than what people are charging for one of these. So that's pretty crazy. I actually wasn't planning on shooting this video this week, but I actually rented this for a job this week, but then the job was canceled at the last minute. And I was gonna cancel my rental, but then the rental package just happened to ship a day earlier than it was supposed to. So I just had some extra time with the camera with nothing better to do. So I thought, might as well just try the camera and do the review. But I guess the good news is, because the camera's been out for a few months now, I've actually seen lots of other reviews from other reviewers, and I'm sure most of you have as well. So as soon as I got my hands on it, I felt very familiar with it. And apart from the new sensor and some new minor video features like the focus breathing compensation and focus mapping, it's really not a whole lot of new things that we haven't seen from Sony before. So instead of just reading down the spec sheet and repeating what everyone else has been saying about the camera, I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to just share my experience and opinions about the camera without making this video 2 hours long. So we have the new body design that we first saw on the A7 IV and the A9 II, which are almost 2 years old now already. And we have the new flippy touchscreen and also the new menu system that we saw on the A7S III. We have the similar autofocusing system from the A1, and this being Sony, we already know that the image quality from the new 33 megapixel sensor will be very, very good. And this also being Sony, we also know that they're going to cripple the specs just enough so this doesn't eat into the sales of those more expensive cameras. I know it sounds bad when I say it like that, but it's true. Sony's not the underdog of the industry anymore. Their product lineup's a lot bigger now, and they can't just throw everything they've got onto all of their new products anymore. They have to be a lot more careful with what they put on their new cameras, and to be honest, they probably know they don't have to try as hard. For example, the mechanical shutter on this camera can shoot up to 10 frames per second like they already could on the A7 III, but while shooting uncompressed RAW, that number now goes down to 6 frames per second. I mean, 6 frames per second isn't terrible, but that's like the 5D Mark III number from like 10 years ago. They also added 4K 60 to the A7 IV, but no, they gotta save that for the A7S III, so on the A7 IV, the 4K 60 is cropped. And they finally added 2 UHS 2 SD card slots on the A7 IV. On the A7 III, only one of the slots was UHS 2, which made the speed of the UHS 2 slot a bit useless when you're shooting to both cards at the same time. And like we saw on the A7S III, the card slot can actually double as a CF Express Type A slot, which is pretty cool. But on the A7 IV, only one of the slots can do that. The other slot is just a normal SD card slot. So on paper, it feels like I'm getting all these nice new upgrades, but then in reality, some of them just feel kind of half-assed, if I'm honest. And even more annoyingly, the price also had to be upgraded to $2,500, which is $500 more than the A7 III's launch price. At least maybe 5 or 6 years ago, these sort of things were a lot more forgivable because we knew at least they were trying. And you know, everyone made fun of Sony for overheating while shooting 4K and lacking lens selections and the autofocus not being very good, but we knew they were not afraid to keep trying and giving us the features that we wanted while no one else would. They made 4K shooting more easily accessible for everyone. Now they have the biggest lens selection for full-frame mirrorless cameras and also one of the best autofocusing systems. But now, after they've solved all of the issues and after we've seen what they're capable of on cameras like the A7S III or the A1, Sony's not giving us full-frame 4K 60, not because they can't, it's because they won't. They can obviously make cameras with faster burst rates, even with much higher megapixel counts, they just didn't want to do it on this one. But surely these may not be deal breakers to many people, but I've criticized Canon and Nikon for the same reasons in the past, so it's only fair for me to do the same for Sony. So I just wanted to get that out of the way before we talk about more exciting stuff, because as we all know, there's a lot of exciting stuff on this camera. When it comes to body design, like I said, we've already had this body design for almost 2 years now. The grip feels so much better than the A7 III's. It just feels like a much bigger camera in general without being actually that much bigger in volume. If you own an older A7 body and if you still haven't tried one of these in person, just stop watching this and go to a camera store right now and try this out. Seriously. New to the A7 IV, what used to be the exposure compensation dial has lost its markings, so you can now customize it to be whatever you need it to be. It actually kind of reminds me of some of the earlier Sony mirrorless cameras with 2 blank dials at the top. And now, finally, there's a dedicated switch for the stills and movie mode, which is a feature that I've been asking for since the very first time I've tried a Sony camera. Now you don't have to go through the entire mode dial to go from shooting stills to movies, and you can also more easily access different shooting modes while shooting videos without getting into the menu. We've already talked about the new menu design on my A7S III review. I was a bit worried after seeing the old menu on the A7C, but I'm glad that Sony is not just keeping this on their higher end models. Another new nice feature is now the shutter curtain closes when the camera is turned off, like on some Canon mirrorless cameras. I never really appreciated this feature on my Canon cameras until I owned a few Sony bodies. I'm really glad that they added this feature. So at least on paper, this seems like the perfect Sony full frame body that everyone's been asking for, but it doesn't mean there's no room for some improvements. Similar to the A7S III, the fully articulating screen's not all that usable when you have some stuff plugged into your camera. The headphone jack is directly behind the top of the screen, and I'm not sure why the covers had to be designed this way. Someone at Sony must have looked at it and thought this was the way to go. But at least the microphone and the HDMI jacks are out of reach of the screen, and as you can see, we now have a full-sized HDMI port. The viewfinder resolution was increased roughly by 50%, so it's now the same resolution as the Canon R6 and the Nikon Z6s at 3.69 million dots, and the rear LCD screen also got a small bump in resolution from 920,000 to 1 million, but still not as high resolution as Canon and Nikon screens. I actually didn't have much issues with the resolutions of the screen, but the dynamic range on the screen doesn't seem to be very good. Sometimes I would be looking at my photos on the screen and some areas of the photos would be completely dark, or it would look like they were completely blown out, but I would look at the photos on my computer screen and they will be completely fine. So I normally don't use the zebra lines on my camera displays, but on this one I had to start using it. I mentioned the new shooting mode switch, and this is actually a really minor thing, but I wish they spaced out the different modes just a little bit more, or at least made them a little bit more notchy, because there are 3 modes including S and Q, and I noticed you had to be really precise to get into the movie mode, or sometimes you get stuck in these in-between modes, so I always have to look at it again and make sure I'm in the right position. Obviously not a deal breaker by any means, but just a little more feedback between the notches would have made it a lot better. And one last thing, and this is more of a conversation starter rather than a negative feedback, and I'm wondering, now that they moved the movie record button to the top from the back, but like now that they have a lot of customizable buttons and dials, including the what used to be the exposure compensation dial, why not just label all the buttons as C buttons, or maybe just not label them at all? Because what if I'm not a video shooter, or what if I want the movie record button to be somewhere else? Why not just let the user decide what they want the movie record button to be instead of just putting it there? Because if you're coming from any other Sony cameras other than the A7S III or the A7C, now there's a giant red circle where my white balance button used to be, or whatever else you had it as. And if you're going to be using this camera along with an A7 IV or an A9 II or whatever, you're going to have to adjust the way you set up your camera a little bit. And, obviously not a deal breaker, but again, something to think about. Now let's talk a little bit about that new sensor. Sony sensors were always known for their great dynamic range and low light performance, and somehow, in some ways, they always managed to continue to improve. Based on my testing, the low light performance wasn't all that different from the A7 III, but considering it now has 9 more megapixels, I guess that's a big improvement on its own. When I tested the A7 III against the Canon R6 last year, their low light performances were pretty much on par with one another, and now the A7 IV is also on that same level, which again is pretty amazing considering the R6 has a 20 megapixel sensor. I also compared the dynamic range against the A7 III, and for me, the most noticeable difference was while bringing back the highlights. As you can see in this image, some of the texture of the panels were blown out on the A7 III's image, while the A7 IV's image was able to retain most of the detail. While shooting casually, I felt like it's almost impossible to mess up your exposure with this camera. I took this photo by accident while walking around the other day, and I had no idea what it was when I saw it on the screen, but as you can see, I was able to bring back most of the details. At some point, I actually just kind of stopped paying too much attention to the settings because I always knew I could fix everything in post. And not saying I recommend shooting that way, but I'm just saying as long as you're within reasonable range, you can always fix your exposure in post. I've complained that you only get to shoot 6 frames per second while shooting uncompressed RAW, so I decided to test exactly how much you lose while shooting compressed RAW. And as you can see, the compressed RAW image clearly has a lot more noise in the raised shadows. Here's another image, and it's pretty much the same story. So that's the price you have to pay while shooting 10 frames per second. And I guess if you're shooting fast action outside on a sunny day, it shouldn't matter too much. But for everything else, I would give up the frame rates for the extra image quality any day. In terms of video specs, like I mentioned, the biggest addition is the 4K 60, although that's cropped at 1.5x. But the good news is, the slight crop that the A7 III had at 4K 30 is now gone, so you can now at least shoot 4K 24 and 30 at full width video. I haven't had much chance to play around with its video features, but for average video shooters like me who mainly shoots videos for YouTube, all I can say is that the 7K oversampled 4K quality is excellent. And although the Canon R6 can shoot full width 4K 60, unlike Canon, I haven't experienced any overheating, and also unlike Canon and Nikon, the A7 IV doesn't have the 30-minute recording limit. And I haven't seen a lot of other reviewers mention this, but to me, personally, one of the biggest improvements between the A7 III and the A7 IV is the low light autofocus performance. In similar conditions of -2 EV or below, the A7 IV did a much better job locking onto subjects than the A7 III, and this was perhaps one of my biggest complaints of the A7 III and the A7 R3, but it's great to see that low light autofocus has been drastically improved. So to sum up the A7 IV, obviously this is a great camera without any doubt, and even with the $500 price hike, the Canon R6 is actually the same price, so you can't really complain about that. It's got the best overall package, the biggest lens selection. Yeah, some of the corner cutting that they're doing is pretty annoying, but still, almost everything's been upgraded from the A7 III, which was already considered to be one of the best all-rounded hybrid cameras in the past few years. I guess if you're a full-time sports shooter, maybe the Canon R6 might be the better option for you because you get a much smaller file size while being able to shoot a lot faster. But other than that, I can't think of a lot of other reasons to get anything other than this in this price range. I guess unless you really need that full frame 4K 60, or unless you're already shooting Canon or Nikon. So will I be getting one? Well, it's hard to say, because if all I cared about was the image quality, then yeah, this is probably the best option in this price range. But it's not like any other cameras are terrible in that regards. No camera on the market today just inherently takes bad photos. Some people always act like the image quality is everything, but if you're taking bad photos with an R6 or the Z6 or even the A7 III, that's probably you, not the camera. If I ever get an A7 IV, or if I were to upgrade from something like an A7 III, I think it'll be mainly for the body design or the autofocus, not necessarily the new sensor. And of course, if you can ever find one in stock, that is. So that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you for watching. And if you have any more questions about the A7 IV, just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to them all. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.